Hello. Ah, I feel so far away. I'm used to teaching in my living room, not near that far away. Um, this Parsha is, it starts, and Moshe he's teaching, he's telling everybody, he's telling them, we're about to go into the land. You're about to go in the land. He's not going in the land. Um, he's pleaded with Hashem again, asked, can I go? And he says, no. And he says, for the first time, he says it's because of them, instead of saying it's because of his hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock. But he says it's them. I'm not even going to approach that. I'm just going to leave that alone because I started digging into that and it was a whole long rabbit trail of its own. So I'll let you get into that one. But sometimes it's hard. You're just reading, and because of the way the Torah was written, it's just one big long run-on sentence forever with no punctuation and no beginning and no ending and no indentation. So it's hard to find the beginnings and the endings of things. But y'all know, we've said it before, we love Aleph Bet. He was watching Rabbi Foreman and he broke it down for me. So I'm going to tell you what he said. This Parsha is there inside, there's many speeches, many little speeches inside of this big long speech that Moshe has given. So this week we have three of his little mini speeches, and the way that we find them is looking for there's some kind of bookends that he throws in. Like at the beginning of the first speech is like at chapter 4, verse 1. He says, "Now listen, Israel, to the laws and rulings that I'm teaching you in order to follow them." And then we know when he's going to conclude, because we get over here in verse 40, and he says, "Therefore, you're to keep his laws and mitzvot, which I'm giving you today." And that's the end. And so then the next time that he says, "Then Moshe called to all Israel and said to them, Listen, Israel, to the laws and rulings which I'm announcing in your hearing today." He's starting again. That's in chapter 5. And then he ends again over here in verse 6, in chapter 6, verse 3. And he says, "Therefore, listen, Israel, and take care to obey so that the things will go well with you." That's the end again. And then we start over in verse 4 with Shema Yisrael. Listen, Israel, God is one. And then he ends that at the end of the Parsha where he says, "Therefore, you're to keep the mitzvot and the laws and the rulings which I'm giving you today and obey them." So he's like, we've got these three little speeches. And I went, oh, wow, that makes so much better sense than this big one long thing. So in the first speech, Moshe tells us to obey these commandments and not to add to them, not to take away from them. He reminds us of what we've seen Hashem do. They've just been at Horeb, and they've just 40 years ago, their family was not them. They weren't there. Think about it. This is 40 years later. They haven't been there. And he says, you were there. So I take that to be like Passover. We can say we were there because they weren't there and they were there. So we can be there. So we've been there. We've seen what he's done. He's came down, he's spoken, and we haven't, we've heard, and they were afraid, and they said, okay, you go talk and we'll listen. And so he takes them back through all of that. He's just recounting, this is what happened. But he says in verse 6 why they're supposed to take this behavior into the land. It says, all the peoples will see you as having wisdom and understanding. And when they hear all of these laws, they'll say, this great nation is surely a wise and understanding people. And there he gives sort of Israel's destiny, Israel's mission. You're supposed to live Torah for the purpose of the world seeing our God. And isn't that what we're supposed to do now? We want the world to see God living through us. So he tells us how to carefully and diligently watch over our lives and to not be distracted from that destiny. He says, you can't just live like these people that you're going to go live among, because then you'll just act like them. You've got to live the way I'm telling you. That's why I'm giving you this, and I want you to protect it. And so we have to recall those things. We have to, for our personal selves, we have to think, it's an everyday thing. Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? And of course, we have to then pass that on, because here these again are not the people that stood and were at Sinai. These were their 40 years later. These were their children. So he says you have to tell your children. You have to be diligent. This is not going to last very long if you go in and you do like everybody else. They're not going to remember. I think I have to remember that sometimes, that my children don't remember everything that I remember. They just know what they've experienced. And so if I don't say, well, this is why we're doing this, they don't know. It's not, I know why I'm doing it, but they don't know why we're doing it. So we have to remind that. We have to have spiritual markers in our lives, just like they did. That's why we have, the feast. But there's other things. Like, do you remember the day that the light bulb came on and you said, I want to serve God in this way. I know that this is what I'm supposed to do. Do you remember that light bulb, kind of thing? They didn't have a light bulb. We raised them that way. So, they need a light bulb. So we have to pass on those markers. And then the remainder of the speech, he says, when you get into the land, you're gonna become corrupt over time. So there you go. You're going to blow it yet again. So and you'll live there, and you'll be scattered. You'll serve other gods, and that's something we can all relate to at some point in our life. And so then he goes on to encourage us in verse 29. He tells us, but from there you'll seek Hashem, and you'll find him when you seek him with all your heart and your being. And he ends up by saying that because God loved our ancestors, we were chosen to know and establish in our heart that Hashem is God and there is no other. And then in verse 40, there's that bookend. He closes it out. And Israel's destiny and their mission has been established, that you're going to go, you're going to carry this lifestyle, and the world is going to see you, and then it's going to get a little wonky. And so then he moves into speech 2. And he tells us that the covenant made at Horeb is with us today. It's not just the people who were there. That's where he talks about, they were physically present, but you were present. So we're present. And then this covenant was not only with them, it was with all of us. And so then if this one speech is our mission, then speech 2 is the how to actually live it out. And so we're reminded of the 10 Commandments for a reason. And I'm going to kind of take a little aside onto the 10 Commandments, because I didn't go down the rabbit trail of Moshe talking about why he was, God was angry, but I want to go down this little rabbit trail because this one I found too interesting. I've always heard about like the 10 Commandments being like the table of contents, so kind of everything else fits in there. All the other commandments fit somewhere in there. And that 4 of them are about God and the other 6 are about people. And I really like the way he described it. He said that the one tablet is, there's 5 on the first tablet, and that 4 of them have to do with our relationship with God. But the 5th one is about our parents, but they're like, it's really like our creators. You wouldn't be here if your parents didn't create you. I mean, as well as God having created you. And so they're like all vertical. And the others are all to your peers. They're all horizontal. And so I said, wow, that's really cool, because that's a little different than just God and people, but to think of that. And so then he goes on and he describes that each of them, the top 2, like, I am Adonai your God, and do not murder. Now, I don't really think of those being really connected, because like one's about God and one's about people. I'm not, but whenever we think about the decision that may be made to murder someone, it's like, I don't want you to be a part of my life. And we don't usually follow through with that. Most of us don't kill people. But how often do we just cut somebody out of our life, just ignore their existence? And that's the same as if we don't say he's God and acknowledge that. There's people that walk all through life. They never acknowledge he's God. So they've essentially cut him out. And that's the way we relate to people and the way we relate to God. You can just essentially cut them out if you don't want to have them as the place that they should be. But he says that we have to learn to deal with the people that are in our lives, because they have a place, they have a reason to be there. And the same way we have to learn to deal with God in our life, because he has a reason to be there. And then I thought, okay, well, that one, that worked. So I'll listen to the next one. He says, you're to have no other gods before me. don't no idolatry. Okay, and do not commit adultery. And I'm okay. Those are kind of easy because that's like two sacred relationships. I don't want anything else in God's place, and my husband doesn't want anything else in His place. So good, we're good with that. That's kind of easy. Those should have nobody else in, or no other thing taking their place. The next one, I had to really strain on this one. Do not misuse the name of Adonai your God, and do not steal. And I went, I don't get that. And so then I looked, and there's the Hebrew word for steal can be translated as carrying away a human body, like kidnapping. You can that particular word could be translated that way, and I was like, okay. And then the word that's like when we hear take, do not take Hashem's name in vain, can be translated as lifting that name and carrying it away. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I could see that if you took my body, or if you took His name, how did He reveal Himself? Whenever He said, well, who are you? He didn't come stand in physical form. He gave us His name. And that is how He interacts with us in the physical world. And we interact in the physical world in our body. I was like, okay, that I can see that. So then the fourth one then is to observe Shabbat and set it apart as holy, and do not give false evidence against another person. And so it's like, okay, it's our testimony. We testify that God is God when we set apart Shabbat and honor Him that way. And if I'm talking about my neighbor, whatever I tell you about him, if you don't know him, you're going to believe me. I have given you a testimony about him. So if I lie, I have, hurt him. So if I tell you the truth, then I've given you who he is. And I've said that's who my neighbor is. So now you know that's who my neighbor is. So both of them are our testimony about that person. And then the last one is really kind of deep. Honor your father and mother, and do not covet. And I was like, okay, we honor our parents whenever we acknowledge that they gave us life, and we say it's a good life. Sometimes everything they gave us wasn't good, but we can take whatever we got and make whatever out of it. But they gave us life. But if we dishonor them, we're essentially saying, I don't like who I am. I don't think God did a good enough job, and I don't think they did a good enough job. And I mean, we're just not supposed to hate ourselves. And so then we turn around and do not covet. And there again, if you're looking at your neighbor and you see their car and their house and their job and what you perceive to be their life, because you never really know what's going on in that house. And we start to think, I'd rather be my neighbor than I'd rather be myself. And that's what coveting really goes to. Eventually, you just would rather take that person's life than be yourself. You want to take on who they are. And so it's just, don't abrogate yourself. Like, accept yourself as you are, as God made you, and what His purpose and plan for you is. And I was like, oh, well, that's really cool. I've never really looked at the 10 Commandments like that. I don't know if you have, but I was really like, oh, this is exciting. So when you take those 5 principles there and put them all together, you come up with not doing wrong things to God, and then not doing wrong things to yourself. And you come up with respect. And that is how Rabbi Hillel answered the question, the story where the person comes and says, teach me the Torah while I stand on one foot. And he says, the thing which you hate, don't do it to your friend. And that's the same as what Yeshua said, do unto others what you have them do to you. It's respect. And that's like, wow. I mean, it makes it so much simpler. But anyway, I found that interesting. So from there, we don't use Hashem or people for what we want, not for our selfish desires. We don't go, like the Santa Claus in the sky and give off our laundry list of things we want. That's not the purpose of Hashem in our life. It's not the purpose of people in our life to say, I need you for this, but I'm not, don't call me when you need something. That's not how it is. So in the respect, then we can build love between each other. We build unity between each other. We build community between each other, and we build a relationship with God. So then we get to speech 3, and we hear, the Shema. And so we're recognizing the oneness of God. And it's like, wow, okay, so He's so amazing. And then the exhortation to tell our children again is repeated. And the commandments, that's where we get like the commandments for like tefillin. Our commandments for hanging mezuzah on our door. So we're told to take care and not forget who he is. Put him into our life. He's this grand. We're serving him. He's told us how. Now, here's your implementation of that. When we're living in your home, when you're out in public, wherever you are. And then you're going to have all of these things that aren't really yours, because we're going to, remember they're going across the Jordan. They're going to enter this land. And they're going to live in houses that don't belong to them. And they're going to have crops that they didn't plant. And he says, and don't forget him. Don't forget him. You're going to experience all this blessing, but don't forget who gave it to you. Don't forget how you got it. You didn't do anything to get it. So, God, that's your source. And your children are eventually going to say, well, what are all these laws we follow? Why do we live like this? We don't look like the other people that live here. So why do we do this? And that's when you tell them, Hashem is our source. He's not just a source. He's the source. Like when we want rain for our crop, we don't go ask the rain God. We go ask like the God who thought of rain and the dirt and us and the plant and everything. So we go to the source. And in that place of awe, then we're able to feel really close to that God and realize he's our creator and he's our father and he sustains us. And our life is as it is because of him. He brought us here. And that's what your children need to hear. That's what the next generation needs to hear. That's what your grandchildren need to hear. And that will change how they view what existence that they're experiencing. Teach appreciation for the things that they're like my older kids say all the time, well, Ember doesn't remember whenever we had this or that or didn't have this or that. She's always had everything. And we're like, well, that's great. It'll be harder for her to appreciate anything she has because she's always had everything. Actually, you probably will get a better experience out of it because you didn't have everything. So we have to teach her to appreciate. It's a conscious thought. We actually, because she's just always just had everything in her face. So she definitely is one of those who's living in a house she didn't build and eating at a table she didn't prepare. So they need encouragement to marry well, to marry those people who are going to live like them and encourage them to continue to live as they've lived. So that your children don't go off and end up in la-la. They go off and end up raising up more children who are following in your ways, in God's ways. And finally, he says, none of us were chosen because of our greatness. Anybody here, like God said, hey, you're really great. I want you to come. No. And just like Israel was tiny. He didn't choose them for their size. It was his love for Israel, and it's his love for us. That's why he chose any of us. So last week's Parsha just reassured that God's presence was with us. He was willing to fight for us, and that gave us a foundation of trust to build on. So then this week, these three statements. This is going to be your identity, your mission field. This is what your purpose in life, this little bitty tiny place. And then this is how you're going to do it. And I'm God. I'm stepping in. I'm going to make it happen for you. And that's really how our relationship, the relationship that Yeshua desires to give us. He says, here's this big wide open door. Come in. Here's my Father. Everything he's got, he wants to give to you. He just wants you to come and serve him. This is how we're going to do it. I mean, isn't that what the Messiah did? He brings us in, says, you're part of the family. I love it. So, yeah, Baruch Hashem.